Hi, I'm Lynn.
And I'm Amanda. And this is The Pursuit of Badasserie, the podcast.
This podcast is all about taking action and creating that badass business abundance and life that you want.
Where we share stories, laughs, wins, and epic fails to show you the whole picture of the entrepreneurial journey.
It's not just unicorns and rainbows, people.
Jump on and follow us through this raw and witty roller coaster,
where we get down and dirty and go behind the scenes of life and entrepreneurship.
Get on it,
get over it,
and get after it.
Hi, I'm Lynn.
And I'm Amanda. Welcome to The Pursuit of Badasserie, the podcast. Today we are talking about time worth value. Lynn, can you explain it to everyone a little bit about what that means to you?
Yes. So time worth value is the amount of money or worth your time is. And so one of the rules of thumb is to take, how much money you make at the end of the week, how many hours that you spent, and you divide that. And so then you figure out how much essentially your hourly is. There are a lot of other factors than that, but that's like your baseline of how much your time worth value is or how much you're making, at least how much you're making per hour. Now, the objective though is to increase that time worth value by being smarter, being more efficient, by delegating and making essentially more money in that time with less overhead. And that helps you build the time worth value, as well as time worth value could even be energetic and, effect or meaningful, like how much that time meant to you, what did you really get out of it, spiritually or mentally or emotionally. And we won't necessarily go into that, but just know that that also plays a part when we talk about time worth value, because really at the end of the day, if you're going through the motions and if you don't know financially how much it's breaking down to, if you're not really being present during that time, your time worth value, if you're not spiritual or whatnot and feeling it, your time worth value is really, really small, and your impact typically isn't that large either. And we'll talk about formulas in a bit. But yeah, that's a quick gist of what time worth value.
Yes.
And it's super important. Most people don't even think about their time worth value. They only look at the superficial, I'm working 10 hours and I'm making $1,000. That means I make $100 an hour. Actually, no. How much client acquisition time did you take? How much did you spend on supplies or this or that or website and collateral? And how much time did you do behind the scenes? Especially, and we're both coach consultant / trainers and all that. A lot of people, if we're giving them our price, they say, ooh, that an hour. Well, there's actually a lot of stuff that goes behind the scenes as well. It's not just FaceTime in front of you. It's the preparation, it's the debriefing, it's all of this. And all of that should be accounted for when you're looking at your time worth value.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's so important both for new entrepreneurs as well as seasoned entrepreneurs who may have gotten themselves into a rut or into this pattern that they're creating for themselves, because it's really hard to think about your income in a way that's more abstract. So yeah, like you said, if you're making $1,000, you worked 10 hours, okay, you're making $100 an hour. But like you said, there is more to it than just the actual physical hours you worked. So there are, lesson plans or preparation emails, what happened before, what happens after that contributed to that meeting. And all of the other things that you have, whether it's supplies you had to buy, prep time you have mentally, things that you had to do, all the things that come into play. And so I'm not trying to say that we're fluffing up the amount of money that we're worth just based on all these arbitrary things. And as an entrepreneur, there are a lot of things that you do in your day-to-day that should be included in what you are worth. So you made the example of a coach. So it might be X amount of dollars for a month of 4 training sessions or 6 or 12 or whatever. And so at face value, you're like, oh, well, you're worth this many dollars an hour. That's what your hourly rate is. But there is a lot of behind the scenes that you don't necessarily bill for up front. And so, for example, when I was a television producer, production hour. Okay, maybe I'm making $250 an hour as an editor. And then they're like, okay, well, how many hours is it going to take you? You're like, well, are you counting upload time? Are you counting the time it took me to transcribe? Are you taking the count of time, the amount of time it took me to, catalog and log and organize this for you? Like how much of that? I mean, maybe the actual time I spent on the project was 600 hours, but I'm not going to bill you 600 hours. I only billed you this much. But if you're looking at it from an analytical standpoint, my time worth value went down because I didn't bill for the $600 or 600 hours that I actually worked. And you make this estimate like, oh, I don't want the client to pay for the amount of prep time I needed for this, that, and the other. And a lot of times you should. A lot of times that the value that you have should include the prep time that it takes for you. And I'm not saying like, if you had to go back to school and learn underwater basket weaving in order to coach this client, that you should charge them for all of your hours in underwater basket weaving school. I'm not saying that. And there is a fine line there, but you should still consider your time worth value affected by those decisions that you make and how you bill and how you allot your time.
Oh, absolutely. There's a couple of things that you said in there, and I want to give a different example too, because I know not everybody that listens to this podcast are those that are like coaches, consultants, or that bid or give an invoice after the fact. So I want to give another example. I'll give a realtor example in a second. And a few other things like obviously training and like the learning aspect, that is a part of who you are. And like that is a part of what you should eventually, it's kind of like an asset, if you would. It's not necessarily a liability because it's not losing money if you get training, right? However, you need to work that in. I think that when you're getting trainings and things like that, and I go back to a rule of thumb, which doesn't necessarily have to do with the time worth value, but it kind of does in an obscure way, is that one of the best pieces of advice I got when I went into coaching, consulting, training is start wherever you are in a price point, but then every time you go back and get training, especially that you can use to more clients and maybe not a specific client, always raise your prices, because that is going to help you make back the investment that you're making into yourself, right? So with that being said, there are also things that we need to take into consideration is, at the end of the day, when you look at really how much you're making, because also then on top of everything that Amanda said and I said earlier, then you have to pay taxes, you have to pay gas, you have to pay office supplies. Like there's so many other things. And I remember when we first opened up our security company and we were billing the guys hours, I think at $85 an hour, maybe at 65 originally. And then one of our vendors came and he's like, hey, you need to bill at X times amount of what you pay them and as a base rate, because you have, your vehicle, your TDI, your workman's comp, all of this other stuff that you have to account for as you're doing it. And I just spent a week with one of my dear clients and dear friends that own a contracting company. And we were talking about this, like when they're doing billing, especially with COVID, because of the cost of things and different things that they've actually had to raise their prices. So I know we're super mad at like a lot of the prices that were being raised after COVID. There's a reason, because other costs went up. And so when we're figuring out our time worth value or TWV, we need to be paying attention to also the raising of costs, but also like our own capacity and our own sanity. If you don't look at how much your true costs are, your true time worth value, which will help you understand your time worth value, and that number that happens does not mean that that's your time worth value. That number that you calculate after subtracting everything and multiplying and dividing and all the other stuff that we just said, that is the amount that you're getting out. That doesn't mean that you're valued at that, like you're valuing yourself at that. So you need to raise your prices or make changes within your system in order to get that. Because if you are thinking that you're making $500 an hour and you feel like that's good for what you do and all the energy that you put into it and all the little extras and etc., and then you find out you're only making $5 an hour. And I know that sounds probably funny and pretty like extreme to some of you. However, I've worked with a client before and literally it was, I forget, like $300-400. But when they took out all of their expenses, all of their overhead, like everything, they were actually in the negative. because they couldn't figure out why they couldn't get ahead. And I was like, well, that's because this is what you're doing. You're spending 10 hours with the client when it's only 1 hour on that particular client for this one particular hour. Like, what can we streamline? Then you have this, and you're paying for this type of system to keep up with them, and et cetera, et cetera. They were in the negative. And so really understanding, like figuring out what your hourly is, and we do call it time worth value. However, your time worth, this should give you a baseline of saying, okay, this is why I'm charging this much, because of all of my training, because of my expertise, because of all of my other expenses, which some of them are, pass-throughable, which I don't know if is technically a term, but pass-throughable, and some might not be, and it might be like an overall, and that you get bonuses because some clients will take less time than others, but you need to be calculating all of that. I do want to also give an example. Like, it's not those of us that can bill ahead of time. Take a realtor, for example. You get a commission after the fact. However, sometimes some clients are more difficult than others, and maybe you're spreading yourself too thin. So one way, I worked with a client who was a target market, and one way that they increased their time worth value was, actually a couple ways, is they really got specific on their target audience, because then it took less time for closing them because they really could communicate with them. They only stayed in one particular area, and they stayed within a certain price point. So and they also streamlined some of their back end stuff, actually the majority of their back end stuff. And this is how they increase their time worth value. A lot of people look at realtors as an example and say, holy shit, they make like, this big check at the end, etc. However, really good realtors are putting in the work, and they are being smart about the business. And there is a lot of expenses that are happening for them to be so good. And then you have those ones that happenstance it. But at the end of the day, like, understanding those aspects are going to help us really feel more value in ourselves and provide, in my opinion, when we really understand and embody our time worth value and work for it. I will put that caveat in there, and work for it, because some of us feel we're worth $10,000 an hour, but yet they don't do the work. And if that is you, get on with your bad self, but you're probably not our target audience.
Correct.
With that being said, you have to feel it yourself. You have to, though, understand your numbers in the time worth value bucket. I mean, numbers, period, but definitely.
Yes. I think that understanding your numbers is I know it seems like this scary thing, like, oh, I'm not really good with the books. There's so much passion when you start a business, and so much excitement over the idea and the project. And then a lot of times the books are neglected. And I'm not going to try to make this podcast about like, know your books, though you should. And I think that the time worth value translates into that, because I think for me, a lot of the clients I've worked with are afraid to raise their prices because they're afraid their clients will reject them. They're afraid they're going to lose the clients they have. Everybody's struggling. We all get it. And that's all true. And if you're really looking at your time worth value and how the numbers really break down, so many people are working for negative numbers there, or for like $2 an hour. You're like, did you really get into business for yourself to work for $2 an hour? Is that why you quit your job at this, corporate sphere to work for yourself so that you can make $2 an hour? And I know there's a passion project there, and I know there's a lot of passion. And I feel like every year you need to reevaluate your finances. And this, we're starting at the beginning of the year. Like, this is a great time to look back at 2022 and assess how much time you spent in your job, where you spent the most time, what you can clean up in your process. We're talking about action items because we're always talking about action items. Actually take the time to look at it and see if you need to make an adjustment in how you charge people. And I always tell people that although nobody wants to think about the inflation and changing their prices just because the inflation rates, if you don't adjust your prices or the way that you're operating your systems, you're basically taking a pay cut every year that inflation is a thing, which it's always a thing. So let's say inflation goes up by 3%. If you don't make adjustments either in how you are operating so that you're taking less time to do things, or in what you're charging so that you're getting more value out of that same amount of time, or how it works. If you're not making those adjustments, you're taking a pay cut based on inflation every year. Absolutely. So if inflation goes up 3% and you don't make any changes, you've just taken a 3% pay cut that year.
Absolutely.
whether or not you planned it. And you may think in your head, like, oh, I'm going to stay the same, I'll be fine. But if you look at the numbers and you look at just all the expenses that go up in your life, whether it's a supply chain issue or just a software price going up or gas prices to get to your locations, there are other things coming. And so your time worth value is decreasing just because you wouldn't reevaluate. And I'm not saying that your global, a task is to raise prices every year. That's not what I'm saying, because sometimes it is just how you're managing your time and getting more out of the same amount of time so that you can spread that and not necessarily increase prices for your clients, but maybe it's choosing a different supplier who may be as good, but $100 cheaper, and that adds up. And it's little things, but you have to be cognizant of it, and you have to really think ahead and really make those changes as an entrepreneur, because it's going to make or break your time worth value, and it's going to make a difference in your burnout and how long you can sustain this career. Because there are a lot of things that happen being an entrepreneur. There's so much more to deal with than just clocking in and out and, hitting a punch card and going home at the end of the night. And there's more to it. And if you think about from an employee standpoint, all those employees who are burnt out are the ones who are doing work outside of their 9 to 5. I mean, there's other reasons too, but if you think about like, oh, I'm getting paid a salary, and I was also asked to come in, if you like the movie The Office, they're asked to come in on a Saturday, but they're still getting the same salary. Those are the burnout things that happen because you're doing beyond your time worth value. Your time worth value is going down. And it can even happen in a salary job, not just for entrepreneurs, but for an entrepreneur. It just seems much more, for me anyway, escalated because it's all you. Like you are the bread and butter of your company. And so I think it just affects you differently. So if you don't take yourself to task, you're going to burn out. You're going to be working for pittance.
I have a great example that just happened back home with a client, and their contracting company, and they have some office people, and essentially one of the office people is feeling burnt out. Well, we come to find out, like, essentially they're doing more and doing different things, and things are falling through. So they were able to kind of see it, and things were falling through the holes. And essentially, because he gets paid salary, and essentially my client said to him, listen, like, we don't care if you get the job done in 30 hours. We'll still pay you the 40 hours as long as the job's getting done. So let's weed out the BS that you don't need to be doing. Let's tighten back up the ropes, because essentially we want you to feel better about what you're doing. We want you to feel like you're getting paid more for what you're doing as well. Now, you're not going to have employers that are quite as nice as those, but that's pretty phenomenal. And I do want to add a couple of things and then take it one step further with some action items, is that if you are a company, like for me, for the alarm company, like, yes, I did gauge my time worth value. However, I did do job worth value. So at the end of each job, I would take everything in the cost, and I would see like, okay, we spent X amount of hours on this. Like, what was really like my hours and the employees' hours and anybody else who worked on it? And like, really, what was it? And was it worth it? Because if we're not, you don't have to do just time worth value. For those of you that are, I would definitely still do time worth value, but for those of you that are also job based, like a construction company, maybe you're a contractor, like, and so you're only contracted for a particular job, even as a consultant or whatnot, do it per job as well. So that way you can see like the job in its whole. Because if it was an easy job, even if there were difficult things that come up, but I think it's because I was just in the contractor's life recently, like I'm using them a lot as an example, but they have this one client where lots of things have went wrong, but it's just, sometimes we have those clients, it happens. However, the client is super sweet and super kind and understanding. And it's like, listen, like, I get it. And God, I hope that it doesn't always happen to them. However, because of that, it does not feel as straining as a really, a good job where it went pretty quickly, but you had a pain in the tush client, right? It didn't feel as much of value because you were putting up with that. So actually estimating per job, per client, if you're per client, and just in general, your time worth value. So client worth value, job worth value, and time worth value will help you gauge and gain a better picture of like everything that you're doing. And then you can start to say, this is also a good way. And this is where the action items come in, is you can start getting busy work off of your plate. If you don't need to do it, delegate it. If it doesn't need to be done, stop doing it. Stop doing it. Or if you can streamline it, streamline it. Like, this is where delegation, getting things off of your plate, like throwing it off your plate, you don't need to do it, so removing it. This is where streamlining happens, and that could be through, a third party, that could be through a VA, that could be through some kind of tech or app, whatever that is. Finding a system that works for you. This is also where you can help when you start to look at your time worth value and analyze it. You are able to look at your systems and processes differently, because then you can say, okay, now, this one, I really feel like it gave us great time worth value. How can we duplicate that? Like, why did this one work this way and that one didn't as much? And so you're able to see like the actual like places where you can make up for it. And then also, like, again, I know we're talking about the money side, but I will not be doing my self-service if I didn't go back to like the energetic and the mental capacity and the spiritual capacity. Like, if you are feeling super strained and even making like $500 an hour in time worth value, we'll say, or whatever that amount is, a big amount that some people would say, but you're still feeling, maybe it's not the right job for you. Maybe it's not the right profession for you. This can also give you a look in on that as well. And if you're only making $5 an hour, or, an hour with time worth value kind of calculations, and you're feeling really great, I'd still say you want to make more. Don't make $5, because are you paying your bills and like everything like that? So it's just looking at those ways as well, and like finding places where you can be more productive. And this is also, we didn't even get into relationship building, but this is also like, think of it, time worth value. Think of like, okay, how can I get the most for my time, the most for my dollar, the most for my energy, the most for my mental? Like, that is about time worth value.
Absolutely. And, you're talking about not wanting to work with certain clients. And there are clients that I've had in the past where I'm like, you couldn't pay me $1 million to work with this client again. And there's something to be said about that. If you have had a client that is so problematic that just you dread, and energetically the night before the meeting, you're like, oh my God. And you're planning like the worst case scenarios, contingency plans in your head just to get ready and prepped for this meeting or this class or whatever. That should be a big old fat red flag. And from a time worth value, maybe you weren't actually working on anything, but energetically you were in, a mine shaft of just energy suck. So there are occasions that even I, who am very task money oriented, will step away and be like, no, like it's not worth my money. Like, there's no amount of money you could pay me that would make dealing with that person or that situation or that company or whatever worth my time. And that's something you actually need to think about for yourself. Like, what is your cutoff? And if you have clients who are sucking your will to live, I don't care how much they're supplying for you, it might be time to cut them, or at least reevaluate how you deal with them. Maybe it's to delegate them to somebody else in your company. Maybe it's, as much as it hurts your soul a little bit too, to like drop a $50,000 contract, or $100,000 or $1 million contract, whatever the case is, sometimes that will kind of just like knock the wind out of you a bit. And then it will open up the space in your life for something even better. And so if you don't admit to yourself that it's sucking your energy and sucking your life and decreasing your time worth value, you're never going to get there. So it's really okay to say no to big contracts sometimes.
I would agree. And actually saying no to a client or getting rid of a client is one of the best. It's hard. I'm not going to exaggerate. It's hard, but it is one of the best things that you can ever do. And it's almost like a freedom. And I will say, to add to that, actually, I've had a few clients that can. And for those type of clients, when they're bidding them out, they add the asshole tax because they can already foresee. And so to them, they make it worth, because maybe they can pay them enough. Like, if they do get the job or the project, that if they're difficult, that there's wiggle room for maybe a little bit more self-care or vacation afterwards or something.
Yeah.
So just, just keep that in mind. I know we have to come to action items. I know I had one really important point I can't remember, so it might pop up on another podcast, but we do need to get to some action items because we're out of time. So Amanda, what are some action items for you?
My number one action item is evaluate. And I know we hate to deep dive sometimes, like, oh God, if I don't want to spend one more time analyzing myself. And it can really do a lot of good. So looking at your business from an analytical eye and finding out where your time, your energy is being sucked away, where your money is being sucked away, but really evaluate how much, like actually do the math and make it a small chunk. Like just do 1 month. Okay. I made $10,000 this month or made $100 this month and I worked 2 hours. Okay. But then I had to buy $67 worth of supplies and actually do the math. Just pick 1 month and do the math and see how much you're worth. That is my action item for you. Like really, I'm not saying see how much you're worth, but see how much you're valuing yourself at this point. So take the time, do the math for 1 month of your actual time. How much was your time worth value? What was your time worth value? And see if you need to make adjustments if you're happy with that number. And if you're not, time to dig it a little deeper and make some changes.
Absolutely. I did remember, and then I'll give you an action item. So one of the things that this goes with the delegation part is one of the things that my clients or people like often struggle with is like, I don't want to give that away. Like when I can do it myself, and knowing our time worth value actually helps us, because if your time worth value is $200 an hour, for example, and you're hiring somebody for $20 an hour, so you have the $20 an hour person doing all the BS work that you don't want to do. It gives you the ability to make $200 more an hour on top of it. So it's actually investing and making more money. So just keep that in mind. My task is the same. I would say start small as well and just use the simple formula. And then as you get more comfortable with it, add things on it. How much you made, how much time you spent, including like the client acquisition. That's very important. And anybody else who might have worked on it, if you have a VA, if you have an employee, and then just divide it and then see what that number is. And then you can add in like the expenses after that, the taxes would be the next layer, so on and so forth. And just understand what that number is and decide on like, is that worth your time? This also helps you with bidding out jobs. Like if you say, $500 an hour is my threshold, anything above that I'll accept. Then you know this number. So that way when you're bidding out jobs or when you're trying to get a new client, and when you're in a client relationship, you're able to like say, you know what, I don't need to do that because it's not important. It helps us you make decisions differently because we know that our time worth decreases each time. And we're just as important, if not more. And I'm not saying this in a demeaning way, if not more than the client. And the reason why I say if not more is because they're coming to us for solutions. They're coming to us because they want our services or product. So that means that we need to be there and show up too for them. Okay. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. All right, Amanda, another podcast down. So thanks for listening, everybody. And it's not enough to just listen. Make sure you're hitting subscribe and like and leave us a review. Yeah.
And get after it.
Absolutely. See you next time. All right, everyone. It's not enough to just listen.
Now you've got to put it into action.
We are so excited to see what you do next.
If you enjoyed our show, please leave us a review on iTunes.
And to find out more about what we're doing, visit us at thepursuitofbadasserie.com.